Hello and welcome to this armchair travel presented in Cordova Bay on January 23rd, 2024. My name is Richard Arthur. I'm a member of the club and a keen outdoorsman, world traveler. My wife says I'm an excessive fitness junkie, but let's leave that one for today. And without further ado, let's jump into it.
Ever since the world began, we've been to sail a foreign land.
So what am I going to cover today? Well, this is a story of travel by foot, by canoe, but also by boat, by shuttle bus, by ferry, and a fair bit of car. I'll skip that last part, probably not too exciting for everybody, and I'm going to focus on the hike and the canoe stretch. Who's been to Mexico in the group? And how many have been to Hawaii? And how about who's been to Port Hardy? I guess my point is not too many people end up at the north part of this island, but there is so much to see out there. How about Cortez Island? Has anyone been out there? So it's interesting how we travel the world and we don't travel our own backyard sometimes. So just to let you know, pretty fantastic land waits up there. And the rest of the world is taking notice. Some of these places we were at on this trip are getting international recognition. The San Josef Bay, which I'll talk about later, it's top 10 world's best beaches. It was recognized as Canada's #1 wilderness beach by Lonely Planet. This Discovery Islands, where we went canoeing, this is in National Geographic of Canada's 50 best places of a lifetime list. So these places are getting known. So let's talk about our two main characters here in this excursion. So it's me, obviously, there, and my friend Rich Delinda. We're two engineers who met in residence in 1983 and then ended up living together in this drab cement concrete brick building you see there. But there we are today. So longtime friends. I haven't seen much of Rich since he moved to New Zealand in 1990. But he had contacted me and said he's taking a year sabbatical, and since I recently retired, we said we have some time, let's go do a long trip. So that picture was taken by my wife. Beginning of this trip, we went north on the Inside Passage on the BC ferries and had a trip to Prince Rupert, stayed there a few days, so that was part of the overall trip. Also a great stretch, but I won't be covering it today. So the trip was done with Rich and Rich. Let's get into what we did. So the North Island, North Coast Trail. Bit of background there. Again, look like some of us have been up there, some of us haven't. The very tip of the North Island is pretty inaccessible with roads, but at one point before contact with Europeans, it was very well populated. Many First Nations communities up there. And after contact with Europeans, which occurred actually before the explorations of Vancouver Island and its surroundings by Westerners, by Europeans, after that contact, the number of First Nations up there diminished dramatically. It was huge problems with disease in those parts of the world and all through the areas around Vancouver Island. So a lot of people died, and those First Nations dramatically shrank. So that now there's really no First Nations up there on the mainland. The main home of the Tlatelolco tribe or group is in Bull Harbor, which is on that little island just off the tip there called Hope Island. So that's got a community there, and there is some land reserved in the North Coast Trail area for First Nations, but no actual village there. So kind of sad history of First Nations up there. But in terms of naming and how this area got explored, it was in fact a merchant named David Scott who funded Europeans to explore this land looking for trading for furs. And so Cape Scott is named after this merchant, David Scott. And some of the other areas there are named by these explorers. And then further as you go east, were named by Captain Vancouver and Galiano, the Spanish explorer who circumnavigated Vancouver Island around the same time in 1792. So after the debacle with First Nations dying off due to disease, There was then a period where there was contact and trading and activities there, but unfortunately, there was an incident with the British bombing part of where the North Coast Trail is and destroying Nawidi village, which is now gone. So there really, as I say, there's no village sites on there. The North Coast Trail itself passes through pretty remote land. You have to take a shuttle boat in or out to do this trail at all. So that really restricts the number of people on the trail. It's very remote, rarely busy. Really, when we started, it was 8 people. I think the maximum maybe 10 people can get on that boat to get in and out. So it really restricts. It's about 1/10 of the number of people that do the West Coast Trail that do this one. Of course, there's less campsites and so on, but it really felt quite wild out there. Very few people around, so that was a great feature of the North Coast Trail. What about Discovery Island, Desolation Sounds? So this is an area that's Places of a Lifetime in Canada by National Geographic. It's the home still of the Clahous Nation, who live there now on Cortes Island, but are coming originally from Toba Inlet, and the whole area was populated again before contact. Desolation Sound was named by Vancouver, and other names such as the Redonda Islands, redonda meaning round in Spanish, were given by Galeano. Cortes Island was named after the conquistador of Mexico. So these names are coming originally from the explorers. Quadra Island, also named by the Galeano explorers. So this area was explored in 1792 by Europeans who met and interacted with the First Nations there. But then over time, again, the First Nations dramatically reduced in the area till at around the end of the 1800s. There weren't very many, and at that point there were whalers, explorers, miners, and eventually loggers, and finally settlers around 1900 in the area. So you've got some history of that, but it was a well-populated area. About 77 archaeological sites have been identified in this area, so it was extremely well-populated at one time by First Nations. So that's a bit of background on that. I'll get into the route we did a bit later, but there you can see in black dotted line the thinking about the types of routes we were going to do. And then we planned it out based on campsites and how far we thought we could get. So in terms of planning, we decided to plan 6 days for the hike. We're going to do the North Coast Trail, part of the Cape Scott Trail, and then finish in San Josef Bay, which would add a little bit at the end of the hike. So we took 6 days for that. It's recommended around that, 6-7 days. And then for the canoe, we were going to be flexible. It was going to really depend on the weather and the tide conditions. We planned from 100 to 140 kilometers of canoeing out there in the Discovery Islands. We also planned downtime in between. We weren't sure if we were going to make the schedule, and if something goes wrong. So we planned 2 or 3 days of downtime, which turned out to be more than adequate. We didn't end up having any problems at all. It all went really smoothly. We did have to book well in advance. The North Coast Trail, you don't need to reserve on that trail, but you do need to reserve your shuttle, which we did way in advance, about 6 months, to make sure we were good for that. And that will get full, and that's what effectively controls the access to the trail. We did target the campsites we were going to camp at, and the water we were going to need at these different sites, because some of them had very poor water supply, some had good water supply. We looked carefully at the menu, especially for the trip to down the North Coast Trail, because we're trying to be very light here. You don't want to go in with a heavy pack. So we were very much relying on freeze-dried there, but for the canoe part, we could relax and cook some nice meals there, so we were a little less worried about the weight in the canoe part. We weren't going to plan to portage anywhere in particular, so we had a little bit of weight extra that we could use. We took a close look at the tide tables and maps, and the tides were going to be massive, so we were a bit worried about that. But turned out that it wasn't too bad, and I'll talk a bit more about that later from the tide point of view. So let's jump in. We'll talk about the first part of this trip, which was the hike on the North Coast Trail. So we started at Port Hardy, and from Port Hardy you take the shuttle into a place called Shushardy Bay. This is named an adaptation of a First Nations word meaning place possessing cockles. There was a ghost town there which had been founded in 1894 after the First Nations have left. Had a cannery, had a sawmill, but weirdly you just don't see any of that. The trees, the rainforest just takes back the land so quickly. You really don't see any of these relics. I suppose if you bashed your way through the forest there, you could probably find something. But we landed at the start of the trail. Bit tricky getting off the shuttle, actually, because you have to jump onto rocks with your pack on. But we got in there and we started up. We had about 8 people on the boat with us, which was a mix of different types of hikers. There were a couple older gentlemen like us, retired, and then there was a dad with his 2 adult sons from Port Alberni, who were had done the trail many years ago. We're doing it again. And then there was another younger guy. We nicknamed him the Surfer Dude because of the way he talked. And he was, we thought, well, he's going to be probably smoking dope and taking it easy, so we'll probably be able to pass him very quickly. So we were wrong about that. And that's how it went in terms of people. So those were the only people that started the trail from that direction that day. So we set off. We hit the trailhead. We went up and over. So initially you end up going up a fair bit and going over a flat headland, which is very boggy. But luckily for us, it wasn't boggy at all because of it had been so dry before we hiked it. We were hiking in July, beginning of July. So normally it would have been wet, but we had a dry summer, didn't we, last summer? So very lucky for us. Made it much easier to hike than a lot of people have experienced up there with hip deep mud. There was a bit of mud around, but not too bad. We continued over the headland, and when we got down to the first campsite, it was called Skinner Beach. There was our surfer dude already camped there, so he was faster than us, but he's camped as we thought, okay, we're going to leave him behind now. But we kept on going because we wanted to get a little bit of distance under our belt, so we were headed for the second campsite, which we ended up at. It was called Nawiti, named after the Nawiti village, which used to be located there, a First Nations village. So Nawiti was a very pretty campsite. We had some nice camp furniture there, and we didn't camp on the beach. It was a bit rough on the beach, pebbly. But we did take advantage of a little bit of skinny dipping action there, so that was quite nice in the Nawiti River. We got ourselves to clean, which is always great when you're on a hiking trip, that you can get cleaned up in the end of the day when you've been sweaty all day. We also had our first wildlife sighting of the trip, which, okay, with an iPhone you don't see it too closely, but it was one of many sightings we had of sea otters out there, and they're just always fun to watch because they look like they're just chilling in the water when they're eating their crustaceans. And in fact, they only eat crustaceans. Apparently they don't eat fish, so they're always diving down, coming up and sitting and breaking them open on their laps. It's always fun to watch. So that was the Nawiti campsite. The last thing we did before bed, we just sat in the estuary, a tidal estuary. You can see the tides flowing in. We just sat and watched nature on the river there. And you can't see it too well, but there were about 8 or 9 eagles in those trees there, and they were just swooping down and grabbing the jumping fish out of the estuary. It was really a beautiful way to end our first day. Next day we got going and headed towards another beach called Irony Creek, so just continuing along the North Coast Trail. It's a tricky trail. There's a lot of inland sections where you go up and you go down and you go take ropes and ladders. I'll show you a bit more of that in a minute. But initially on this one, it's a very easy walk, just inland a bit, and then you have to climb up this thing because you're going through a cable car.
My pack is clean.
So that's always fun. You load your gear in this cable car.
First cable car of the trip.
You,
Rich is doing the heavy labor.
Oh God,
yourself
we're
across
not
with
going
it. You
anywhere.
make your colleague that you're hiking with to pull you across while you're filming on the cable car. And always works. It's always fun. There is a bit of a risk there, and it apparently has happened that people leave the cable car tied up at the wrong end, or the wrong end for. You shouldn't tie it up at all because you don't know which end someone's coming from, but people do because you tie it up often when you're loading and unloading. Then that really messes it up for the person behind you because they have no way across at that point. So we remembered to not tie it up, and we kept on moving. Here's a few slices of life along that trail. On that day, we passed Cape Sutil, which is another name from Galiano. It's a one of the Spanish ships that he sailed with. And Cape Sutil is the northernmost point of Vancouver Island. But we don't quite go out to the Cape. That is actually a private First Nations land. But we skirt around inland on that. And as I mentioned, there's a lot of ups and downs. These little, what they call pocket coves, pocket beaches, where you go up a headland, you go over, and then you come down into the beach for a short stretch. and often it's ropes and scrambling or ladders and stairs. By the time we finished the Cape Subtle area, we think we'd done hundreds of stairs, and we were getting a bit bored of it. But then we got down onto the gravel, and then when the gravel starts sucking your energy out of you, you're thinking, well, maybe the ladders weren't so bad after all. In the middle, that's a bit of a view of Tripod Rock, which is a landmark along the beach there. You can go inside caves, and quite a neat little spot. And then we'd been told by on the shuttle that some hikers had seen a whale carcass along the trails. That's apparently where that was, because what we found was whale blubber, very stinky, and quite a few whale bones on the beach. So it had been heavily picked over already by the wildlife. Finally, we got to our destination for the night, which was Shuttleworth Bight, Irony Creek. And that was a beautiful spot. So that was our first night camping on the beach. Just had an amazing, wonderful flat spot to camp on and beautiful sunset. Enjoyed that. Got cleaned up in the river. And had a great night on Shuttleworth Bight. Shuttleworth is another name coming from settlers. So Henry Shuttleworth settled here in 1905 and had a homestead just near here. Strandby was named after a Danish town. Was a little site here just at the other end of the bight from the campsite. There had been some buildings there, and some people came to settle there. But as was the story all along this North Coast area, it kind of got abandoned because of the First World War, and then lack of access was a challenge. So that's what happened here. But we didn't see again any of the ruins, so they're just so hidden in the trees. So the next day we set out for Laura Creek on our day 3, and right away we saw some bear tracks on the left and wolf tracks on the right. And so we knew the wildlife had been out probably earlier in the morning or late at night. And we enjoyed hiking along some beaches, but again, it was a lot of scrambling up and down over steep headlands. At one point, we're on a beach like this, and we were pursued by about 7 or 8 Steller's jays. I don't know, they seemed to think we were going to feed them or something, but that was quite amusing. I've never seen that many. They're the pretty black and blue feathered jays. So we enjoyed watching them coming after us. We continued on. By the time we arrived at Laura Creek, it was starting to rain. So we set up not on the beach because wet sand is the worst. But here's a little view of what the site looked like. That's the outhouse. It goes down and into these are old growth stumps, which are quite fun because there's new trees, quite well-established trees, growing out of those old growth stumps. So this must be like 100 years since it was logged there. And as you can see, the area is set up for very wet conditions. Lots of logs you can walk on when it's muddy, flooded out in there. There's a tent platform. There was about 4 platforms on the site. And then, as you can see, we would proceed towards the beach here. And there's the food cache. There's also a baseball bat and a helmet, which we joke were there in case the bears do get near your cache. Then you got something to defend your food with. But in practice, I'm not sure why those were there. There's the tent pad, another tent pad. Finally, there's our tent there with a tarp set up so we could cook under the shelter when it was raining. So that was Laura Creek site. We again had it to ourselves. By this time, the surfer dude was long gone. He'd passed us and got on. Probably was two campsites ahead, but that guy was flying. So we were not able to keep up with that guy. Day 4. So now we're getting more towards the end of the North Coast part. In fact, Nissan Bight is near the end of the North Coast Trail. That day we woke up to a rainy morning, so we put our pack covers on and prepared to hike in the rain, but it was actually quite okay. It didn't rain a whole lot. Again, we went inland and out on beaches and in alternating. Sometimes inland you find these wonderful log bridges. You just take advantage of a log that fell across the river and they carve it up and put a rail on it, and now you have a bridge. So that was pretty cool. Also, some of the trails were quite good in there because they were actually settler roads originally. So these are road is maybe an exaggeration, but they made these trails by felling wood and putting logs along them. So it leveled the area anyway. So you still have these stretches which are quite level here and there. And then you do have still a lot of scrambling over roots and trees and stuff. So it's still mixed. But quite quickly we got ourselves to Nissan Bight, which is again a Danish name. So this is still reflecting the Danish heritage. It's almost like a tropical beach here. And this was just a beautiful beach, really nice spot. Very protected lagoon in the foreground there. A couple of people did go swimming. So there's a few more people at this one because this one is accessible from the Cape Scott Trail, which has quite a lot more hikers on it than the North Coast Trail. So we had about 6 tents maybe on the site. You know, not too busy. Still very, very pleasant. And we set up tent and just enjoyed the scenery there and cooked our dinner. And then while we were just finishing, getting ready to go to bed, we watched this happen.
Preparing
we realized that there was a black bear coming along the beach.
Along the beach on the far
we weren't
shore.
Sure how far he was going to get because then you can see there were some tents there. So we watched him a little bit, thought maybe we should raise an alarm if he gets too close, but in the end he trundled off into the woods a little bit farther along. But the people who were there in that campsite did tell us the next day that he had gone in right behind their site and was crashing around in the woods a little bit. Did freak them out a bit, but anyway, he didn't come anywhere near the campers in the end. So that was our evening. Next morning we got up and I was packing up and I was folding some things. I looked over, I thought, oh, who brought a dog on here? You can't bring a dog on this beach. So that seems strange that there would be a dog. And then I looked more closely and I realized this was not a dog. So this was a sighting of a sea wolf. This is a subspecies of wolf we have here, unique to Vancouver Island. That's the first time I've seen one, and many times I've been out hiking and camping, so that was pretty brilliant. And he just walked in front of everybody. You can see he's as close to the water line as he can get, so he's away from all the campsites, which are up at the top of the beach. But very amazing to see that. He just went ahead and went on the headland. Obviously had a few places he wanted to look for, maybe crabs, things they eat. And then he disappeared off around the headland, so we didn't see him again. But that's really amazing opportunity to see the sea wolf there. So we got up that morning and packed up, and we headed to San Josef Bay. So this is really the end of the North Coast Trail, about 5 kilometers after Nissan Bight, where we were camped. You join the Cape Scott Trail, and that one you can either continue out the Cape Scott Trail right to the end of that, see the lighthouse out there, but instead we went down the Cape Scott Trail to San Josef Bay. And at that point, you're at a much different kind of trail. It's much better graded. It's if you're looking for an easier hike in this area, this is a nice multi-nighter or overnighter that you can do much more easily than the North Coast Trail. You don't need to take a shuttle or reserve to get in there. There's in fact a parking lot at the head of the trail there that is very close to San Josef Bay, and that's where we're going to meet our shuttle. So we plan to camp near there to make it very easy to get up in the morning and get to our shuttle. So we hiked down and we arrived at San Josef Bay, and really this is a spectacular spot. You've got these wonderful rock formations and little water passages flowing in between, and then these enormous expanses of sand there. There's a huge estuary there, which is just a beautiful sandy bay. So really a gorgeous spot. There we are. That's from our campsite there, looking down at the beach, and then a bit of excitement as we had to cross tide to get to our campsite.
Epic hike. Yeah, wait the last
you can actually get access to San Josef Bay very easily. It's a couple kilometers from the trailhead. You can drive along the road, park there, and come in and camp. You can even pull a wagon in. It's a beautiful pathway in there, but the only water supply is at the very far end, which is cut off by this tidal area here certain times a day. So you do have to be a bit careful if you are camping there. You bring water or keep an eye on the tides. So we camped down there and near the water source and near the bear caches, and that worked really well. It was pretty quiet, just a few other campers, and just an amazing spot. So that last day, day 6, we headed from San Josef Bay to the trailhead to meet our shuttle, and we passed by some of the relics of the original settlement here, which at one time comprised 93 settlers, store, post office, church. This is around 1908. So there had been some promise to the settlers that moved in there that the government would build a road from Holberg in there. But in fact, they never did. So after that happened and many of the young left for World War I, things just kind of fell apart and these communities were eventually abandoned. So there's not much visible, but you can find some relics along the trail from that settlement there, as it was quite a large settlement. So that's San Josef Beach and San Josef Bay. It was a very quick walk in. We got the shuttle bus. So we finished that hike. It was fun to meet up with a few of the other hikers on the bus and share stories as we headed into Port Hardy, where we'd left our car where the shuttle departed. So we did that, and we then drove down to Campbell River because then we were going to prepare for the next part of our trip. So we arrived in Campbell River, and it was, I think it was Canada Day by then, or maybe the day before still. So we had a little bit of time to kill. So we saw the sights of Campbell River, so Walmart, Canadian Tire, A&W. Just kidding. No, we we reprovisioned in the Walmart. We stayed at a very nice little hotel called the Anchor Inn, which was a pleasant surprise. It was not very expensive, and it was really nice, really modern and clean, and spacious rooms. And it had this amazing view out over the passage, which is in front of the Campbell River on the open water there, and that's where all the ships go through now. We saw a few cruise ships going by. It was a really neat spot to just enjoy watching things go sailing by. So we stayed there, and then we were off to Quadra Island and then Cortes Island to start the next part of our adventure. So the next part was hitting the Discovery Islands and Desolation Sound. And the name Desolation Sound doesn't do it much justice. This is an area that is anything but desolate, teeming with wildlife, has a rich history of people who have called it home for many thousands of years. They think over 8,000 years. There's 77 archaeological sites already documented there. There used to be many thousands, we don't know how many, but many villages, First Nations people living there. The Clawhoose people are still there, and they have this community in Squirrel Cove. They used to be in Toba Inlet, which we'll paddle by on this trip. So they are still there, but they're much more consolidated from what they were presumably must have been at one time. Around end of the 1800s, you started to get settlers in there in 1900. You also had loggers coming in, some mining, but before that there were whalers already coming in. As you know, there's a whaling history all in the Georgia Strait. You've got Whale Town there on Cortes Island. You've got Blubber Bay, and Texade Island. You know, these are obviously reflecting the whaling that occurred in there and around before those settlers moved in. Settlers moved in 1890s and established some homesteads. And then fishing moved in. There was canneries, things like that. Logging camps, you know, and there's still logging on fishing up there to this day. So a lot going on there. We felt it was a great place to go around in a boat because you got these spectacular scenery. You have the coastal mountains all to the east of you there. And then you've got the Vancouver Island Range all to the west. So you've got this dramatic high mountain scenery around. And it's quite calm in there, you know. I looked at this thinking, well, is it acceptable to go in a canoe through here? Are we going to get in trouble? But, you know, doing the research, which I did, I pretty much established it was going to be fine in the canoe. We did pad the schedule with some extra days in case we got stuck somewhere. Let's say the wind really came up. We needed to plan for that. In the end, very little of that buffer was needed. So we started down in Cortes Island, the very southern tip. We used a site called BC Maritime Trails, which I'm showing here. It gives you an indication of where you can camp. Now, it's a bit vague. Some of them, we couldn't even find some of the stuff that's shown on here. Ones that are green, those are generally established campsites, usually with some facilities. The yellow ones, a bit more dodgy. Some of them couldn't find them at all. So, but we did use it, and for the sites we were targeting, it worked out pretty well in the end. So by a strange quirk of fate, we were able to make contact. My friend Rich, he lives in New Zealand. He has a friend in his theater group, and when he told his friend, "Oh, I'm going to Discovery Islands, Cortes Island," his friend said, "Oh, I know some people that live there." And this was in Auckland, New Zealand. So bizarrely, this guy knew Nora and Jerry, who own a beautiful property in the southern tip of Cortes, right next to the Smelt Bay Provincial Park. So you're looking at the Smelt Bay Provincial Park beach here. So this really helped us because we were able to get in contact with Nora and Jerry, and they invited us to come and leave our car there and to meet them. So that was a nice way to start our trip. and we were able to put in at Smelt Bay and leave the gear we didn't want safely on their land. So beautiful spot, Smelt Bay Park. If you want to go there, you can camp in the provincial park if you can be lucky enough to get a site. So we started out on this trip. This is now on July 3rd, I think, thereabouts, that we hit the canoe and started the canoe route at the southern tip of Cortez in Smelt Bay. And day one, we planned a couple of options. We were hoping to get all the way up to Von Donop, or what is now called Hathayim Marine Park, because we had seen a site shown on there, a couple sites, according to the Maritime Trails website. So we started off, and then we got to Marinas Island, which is near Whale Town, the biggest town in Cortez. And we were thinking about stopping there, but in the end we felt good, so we decided to move on. Wasn't much wind. Tides we were worried about. We could see the tide flowing against us, but in the end it didn't build to a strong current, so we were very lucky about that. And we were really glad we kept on going, because right at that point we had our most amazing whale encounter of the trip. This group of 4 humpbacks were right next to us near a little spot called Whale Passage, so obviously this isn't the first time this has happened. And we were able to just enjoy watching these humpbacks play around and while we were paddling. And so we made it to Hathayim Marine Park, and we couldn't find the site. We reckoned it was probably where we were, but we weren't sure. There wasn't much evidence of any campsite there. Certainly access was tough to this site. We had to scramble up a pretty steep rocky slope. I wrecked my sandals. This is the first day of the trip. I wrecked my sandal. That wasn't so great. But we had a spectacular view of the bay, and we were able to cook our dinner while the sun was setting and just enjoy another whale show that just occurred on the bay in front of us. Just really amazing to watch. Our dolphins came through. Whales were fishing throughout the evening. So it was very worthwhile to be in this site.
Blowing off steam.
And we were glad we were there.
And meanwhile,
So that put us in good stead to
off the coast of
continue to the next day to our next target, which was Walsh Cove. So now we're coming around the tip of Cortez Island to the north end of it, and then continuing across the top end of West Redonda Island, and then into this channel that separates East and West Redonda Island, which we thought would be well sheltered. And there's a reserve there, a maritime reserve called Walsh Cove. So we targeted that, and sure enough, we were able to get to there, and that's a little video showing us as we just came in.
We arrived at Walsh
To
Cove,
the site,
Marine
just
Provincial
enjoying,
Park. We've discovered some camp furniture, so
figuring
we
out
think
that
we've
this
hit
was
on
the
the only
campsite. It was a
possible
little bit hard to
campsite
see
in
from
the
the shore,
cove.
but from the water, sorry.
We
But
might
once
have
we
a
got
few
out, we
more
realized
options.
this was definitely
This
the
one's on a
campsite.
little island though, which is kind of nice, and just a massive oyster bed in here.
It was fun watching the oyster
oysters and
catcher birds playing in
mussels.
and out of this oyster bed
Really nice.
in the evening and in the morning. And yeah, we're just a beautiful sight here. Again, no water though, but luckily we brought quite a lot of water. I didn't put any pictures in. It was quite a dramatic. Actually, no, I did put this one in there. It was a dramatic view around the north end of West Redonda. You're looking up into Toba Inlet there. As you can see, there's still a lot of snow-capped mountains there. There's a wilderness lodge up in there, and then there's even a backcountry ski lodge up there, I think. And so Toba Inlet is a spectacular spot. We didn't have the time to go up in there, but apparently you can go bear watching up there as well in the fall. And all around us, it was quite incredible because the tide was so high. It had dropped, about 2 or 3 meters down the rock faces. So we were seeing sea stars and other strange sea creatures all along the walls. It was really quite amazing. On the other hand, it meant that there was few places you could pull out when you were in the canoe. So you really did have to get to your targeted campsite, which luckily we did. Day 3, we started from Walsh Cove, and we took a look at the maps and the weather forecasts. I had my InReach satellite messenger, so I was able to check the wind and weather every day. And it looked like it was going to be a calm day. It was a bit of smoke haze around, which was unfortunate, but sunny and not too much wind. So we just took the decision to go all the way around East Redonda Island through what's called the Homfray Channel and explore that. And that's a dramatic channel because it's got these mile-high ridges on both sides of it, mountains on both sides. So you can really get this incredible mountain view around you. And that's a little sailboat right at the foreground there in front of the Unwin Range. And we were in the home freight channel, really deserted, just a few boats here and there. And we needed to pull over to get our lunch, and there was very few places to pull over because, again, this tide was so low that, almost no beaches. And even with this terrain, there's very few beaches because you've got these cliff edges dropping into the water. So we sighted a beach and we crossed the channel to go to this beach. And as we approached, we got waved by a man there. We thought, oh, maybe we shouldn't stop here because, we might be coming onto private land. But the guy waved us in, so we continued in and beached our canoe there. And he came over, and this was an amazing encounter because I'd been reading about this guy. If you ever read Grant Lawrence's work, he's written about the Desolation Sound, and this gentleman, Ken Bobian. So Ken is the caretaker of the Lindbergh farm, which is a historic homestead homesteaded in 1912 by the Lindbergh brothers from Sweden, who were a couple of crazy guys. They crossed the United States on horseback, and then they bought a boat, and they were going to go to Alaska, but then the boat broke down on their way through here in Home Freight Channel, and they thought, wow, this is an amazing place. We should just stay here. So they did. And they founded this homestead, and they put an orchard in, and they logged and fished and collected oysters. At one point, they had a turkey farm, and they were selling turkeys to Powell River. So they made quite a success of this homestead here. It's now privately owned by an American family. So Ken is the caretaker. He lives there year round. But he told us some great stories about the homestead there and shooting bears. And he told us that across the channel there on the Mount Addenbrooke, that there had been a large marijuana grow-up there in the 60s and 70s. That came through. Before that, there was loggers, fishermen, that sort of thing. But yeah, it's quite spectacular when you look across from his place. You're looking at Mount Addenbrooke on East Redonda. That goes up 1,600 meters and pretty sheer mountaintop. He says all winter long you've got avalanches crashing down through there. So it's a pretty cool spot. After that, we headed out to Roscoe Bay. So this was our longest day in the end. It took us about 35 kilometers to do this day. So it was a long day, but luckily pretty quiet day in terms of weather and tide. We arrived at Roscoe Bay Marine Park, which is actually back on East Redonda Island. So we'd circumnavigated all behind all these ridges here, come back around. And looks beautiful at this point. When we arrived, that bay was empty. It was completely bare, no water in it. We had to drag and walk through the oyster beds to get up there. But once it filled in with the tide, it was a really beautiful spot. Tide was covering some of the tent sites, so we had made a good choice for our site and stayed above the tide there. We pulled the canoe right up, so we weren't sure how far the tide was going to go. So we set up our camp and did our dinner, and I was going up to the food cache to put the food away for the night, and when I had a very strange encounter. I was walking along the path, and what seemed like a rock was falling down through the undergrowth, through the ferns, and I thought, that's strange. Maybe a deer or something kicked something and released it down the slope. It's bouncing down through the ferns, and then suddenly I thought, no, that can't be right. That must be a creature. What kind of creature is that? And then this incredibly adorable face came out of the woods and looked at me. And turned out it was a marten. It's like a American marten. And there were two of them. They were chasing each other. Maybe they were fighting, mating, I don't know what, but playing. But anyway, here's a little bit more of the marten because they're so cute. And they were very bold. They didn't run off from us. They played around for a little while, and then they made their way off. But that was really fun to see that.
Flying leap.
So day 4, we continued as our second last full day. We continued around. Now we're on West Redonda, going around there. This day we were planning to get to a spot called Tackern Arm, and that took us via Refuge Cove, which is here in the right-hand side picture. This is a boater's stop-off point on the coastline here. It's got a store. There was a store there in 1920 was built originally, so it's been there for a long time. In fact, it was a regular stop for steamships at that time because the steamships went through there. The Ripple Rock, which many of you probably know the story about how that was blown up to make a passage easier. So that hadn't been blown up, so they had to skirt that route and come via these channels. So at that point, it was quite bustling here. People were coming in and out. Nowadays, it's more pleasure boaters, as you see, fishermen, So we went in there. We had probably one of the most expensive cappuccinos I've ever had, but it was a nice treat while we were on a camping trip. And we continued along after that and finally got to Tiacar and Arm, and where we saw the site that it's most famous for, which is this amazing waterfall that comes out of the rock face right into the ocean there. And then you hike up the side of this waterfall and inland a little bit, and where the water is coming from is actually a big lake. Castle Lake, which was amazing for a swim. Water was pleasant, clean, seemed to be clean. So we took a nice long swim up there, got cleaned up, and yeah, looked beautiful. Gave me some kind of stomach infection, which I had for 2 weeks afterwards. So that was the downside of that. But anyway, it was a nice spot. So the next day was our last full day. We were continuing from Tiacar and Arm back down through the channel between Cortez and Redonda Islands. And our target was Twin Islands, which is southern, again, pretty close to the southern end of Cortez, so that we'd have a short jaunt for the last day to get back to our car park to get to finish the trip. So here's a little video just to give you a taster of what things were like there. That's the dock. We'll get off to go up to the lake we showed you. And then we had a look at the falls there before we left. When we arrived, there was a boat actually anchored right in the bay there, so we couldn't get in. We were able to pass by it in the morning, and empty boats were gone. It was just us and seals by then. So we enjoyed seeing the sights. Had a nice easy paddle out of the water was fun. There's a couple of aquaculture farms that day. Mussels and oysters in there. And then things got a little hairier. We headed out around that island you can see there and into what's called the Lewis Channel, which is the channel between Redonda and Cortez. And we encountered the most wind and waves we'd seen the whole week. The GoPro's motion compensation is so good that you don't even really feel it. But we were just getting tossed around in that water. That waves were getting the wind was hitting us. So we had to really battle that for about 2 hours to get up to what you can see in the distance there is Squirrel Cove, the Clahus village, which was a nice place to get some shelter, have a little lunch break. So we did that. And then we got back out on the open water, but we managed to sort of skirt around the edge of Cortez Island there and didn't have such a bad experience after that. But we were exhausted by the end of that day. So we had some trouble finding Twin Islands because this campsite is so well protected by the trees around it, and the access was pretty challenging. I had to walk across a very sharp oyster bed, scramble up some rocks to get in there. But once you did, what an amazing campsite. Beautiful sunset there, very quiet, calm, nobody else. I mean, we never saw any other kayakers or canoers on this trip. It was really canoeists. It was really amazingly quiet from that regard. All these land-based campsites were very quiet, just us basically. There was boaters around, and they would anchor in the bays sometimes, and we'd talk to them and whatnot when they came ashore, but then they would go to their boats and we didn't see them for the night. So anyway, but here we didn't see any other boaters, and just enjoyed this amazing campsite for the night. Final night, Rich cooked his pièce de résistance, some salmon fish fritters, which were pretty delicious. That was the only night we camped with our fly off, so we could just enjoy the stars and feel really safe on this little island. So that was our last full night. So then the next day we got up and we headed towards Smelt Bay, where we'd left the car, and that was just a short little couple hours in the canoe. Arrived back there, said hi and bye to Nora and Jerry, and headed out. So that was our day. So 6 days, we managed to accomplish the longest route that we had targeted. We didn't cut it short anyway. So we ended up doing about 140 kilometers of canoeing over 6 days. Longest day was 35, so you can see day 1 to Vondona, day 2 over to Walsh Cove, day 3 through the Humphrey Channel to Roscoe Bay, day 4 southern end of West Redonda to Tiacar and Arm, day 5 back out from Tiacar and down through the Lewis Channel, Squirrel Cove, and then to Twin Islands, and finally completing the loop, Rich was angry with me because I made him complete the loop at the end. I couldn't have the trace not showing complete, so I had to paddle an extra 50 meters to complete the loop. So that was our trip. And yeah, just really an amazing spot up there. I really recommend you can go up there very easily to get to Cortez Island. Other ones you will need a boat there, but just a beautiful part of the world. Here's just a little close us off. Videos I didn't use during the presentation. Thank you.